Next up, we have low FODMAP organic 100% fruit juice.
Oh boy, I can hear Paul from a mile away screaming, yes, yes, yes! The best and worst sugar sources to eat on the sugar diet. This should be fun.
What are the best and the worst sugar sources to include in your diet?
Right, well, that's just a waste of time. The question itself is a waste of time. I reject the premise. Your infamy here is based on a premise that is completely unacceptable to anyone with any remotely rational intellect. Okay? Mike Fave, Mike Fav, whatever the hell you want to call him. I don't really know too much about him, except for the fact that he doesn't really understand the Randall cycle at all, from, memory. But it's a waste of time because exogenous carbohydrates are not required for human consumption based on every single inference that we've ever aggregated or collected on any population for any given period of time, and also further bolstered by our evolutionary history of our genes withstanding such a stimulus to such a degree that would warrant it being genetically indicated at all, or genotypically indicated. And above a certain physiological concentration in the bloodstream that is most conducively achieved by consuming them, are toxic, evinced by diabetes, a disease characterized explicitly and exclusively as chronically elevated blood glucose and nothing else, a disease in the type 2 version, diabetes mellitus, type 2, that never occurs in individuals that are not consuming carbohydrates unless they have something severely wrong with them. So I reject the premise entirely. So it's a waste of time. It is bread and circuses to sit here and start comparing the best and worst sugar sources, because the only time that would ever be warranted would be if someone were attempting to assess what the most innocuous, the most benign sugar sources are so that they can continue perpetuating ostensibly their addiction. Mike. So no, we're 4 seconds in and I've already said this much. I mean, I suspect that will be sufficient for taking down the rest of this video. Let's see how many new claims I come up with that really further reinforce my disapproval and further reinforce the inanity behind these claims and behind this video, the entire topic of the video in the first place.
Video, I'm going to be ranking 15 of the most commonly available sugar sources.
Okay, so we've got low FODMAP, organic 100% fruit juice. So pure glucose, pure fructose, and pure sucrose, and some sorbitol. Agave syrup, so again, just different proportions of fructose, glucose, sucrose, etc., but still sugar, the same molecules chemically speaking, okay, associated with different types of nutrients that, by the way, are found in entirely sufficient amounts in species appropriate, species specific, at least best approximations to species appropriate, species specific exogenous inputs, food, such as red meat, ruminant meat, particularly. So there's no need to get them from fruit and vegetables and all these other things that are not required for human consumption and also seem to be actively harmful to human beings, even the ones that we've hybridized to be less harmful. So less immediately toxic. Maple syrup, same thing there. Low FODMAP organic whole fruits, so same thing there. But now you've got fiber in there. Whoop-de-doo. Another compound that isn't required for human consumption and really irritates the enteric lining, actually, and doesn't necessarily assist in constipation if one develops it, which, first of all, the question remains, how did you develop it in the first place? Why do you need fiber to ameliorate it? If you're constipated, there's a problem there, and it's not due to fiber deficiency. But also, in many cases, if you're consuming too much fiber, which is basically, it's anything more than zero, but if you're consuming an extremely excessive amount of it, it seems to actually be a culprit when it comes to constipation, which was really demonstrated in the only experimental study done on this topic that even remotely attempted to control for confounding variables, published in the World Journal of Gastroenterology in 2012. So anyway, there's no deficiency disease that's observed whenever you cut out fiber, and also the amount of fiber that we were genotypically exposed to, really I should say genetically exposed to, was extremely minimal. Why do we have an appendix? Okay, and then we've got all this other stuff. So I'm not even going to go through all this. Some of this, I mean, if you're talking about corn syrup, you've got glyphosate, so that's not great.
On a tier list from S to super to F for fail.
Right, so they should all be in fail. And you know what? Even if you're going to use this sort of construct, S to F tier, okay, you should understand that S does not mean very great for you, you should be eating all of it. S is still below, or really you should say S is still above the highest level on the hierarchy of indication. In other words, it's not on that hierarchy because it's not indicated for your physiology. It's just the most innocuous. That's not the same thing as good.
End of the video, I will crown one sugar source as the best of the best.
Right, and we already covered that, didn't we?
One sugar source as the worst of the worst.
Right, F minus. Good.
Before we jump in, if you would like to work with me directly to
why would anyone want to work with you directly, Mike? You're going to sit here and say, I mean, Mike is someone who believes that you should be consuming hundreds of grams of carbohydrates a day. He's a Raypedian who believes in the bioenergetic model of health. So he doesn't understand the Krebs cycle. He doesn't understand the electron transport chain. He doesn't understand the Randall cycle. Oh, wow. And also, if he's a true Raypedian, then he believes that you should be taking aspirin every day as a biohack. So that's good.
set up a healthy diet that includes ample amounts.
Healthy. Okay, so great. Define health, Mike. Health is the absence of disease process. So if you're going to consider something healthy, you will have to provide a study in the area of human nutrition science that can inform upon causally a food having an effect on ameliorating at least one negative heart health outcome, or is really what we should say, hedging against the development of a negative heart health outcome. At least one. Okay? There is no science to inform upon that because despite what people have been led to believe for the last few recent centuries, science can say and inform upon a lot less than people think it can. Causality is an ideal, like God throughout all of history has been conceived as an ideal or conceptualized as an ideal. You should strive as much as you can to attain it, but you should know that you never will. So what you're saying is an opinion. Healthy. That is your opinion.
Healthy sugar sources.
Healthy sugar sources. Begging the question fallacy. So, or well, that begs the question, really. Another enthymeme. Basically a statement or question. If you want to be strictly correct, it's a syllogism that is predicated upon a premise that is not explicitly stated in the statement. Healthy sugar sources. Well, that implies that you can, using science, inform upon something being healthy. And I just covered that about 5 seconds ago.
Optimizing your blood glucose levels.
Okay, so the irony is not lost here. Optimizing your blood glucose levels by consuming sugar. You know, we have this great and very efficient process, depending on what definition of efficient you're using, called gluconeogenesis that occurs in the liver, the proximal convoluted tubules of the kidneys, to a small extent, the small intestine, and to an extremely small extent, the brain, that produces all of the glucose we require for physiological functions through non-glucose precursors, primarily lactate, because if you knew anything about physiology, that just makes sense. Glucose goes to pyruvate, goes to be reduced to lactate by NADH. Then glycerol backbones of fatty acids that you break down in your body that is also recycled through glyceroneogenesis. That's cool. Okay. Then you've got amino acids, usually in the postprandial state. And then finally, odd chain fatty acids, also either during the postprandial state to an extremely small extent or through bona fide starvation, actually. It's mostly common during the extreme sides of every spectrum, extremely well-fed or extremely underfed, through propionyl-CoA. And so that maintains your blood glucose levels at a very steady rate. One should understand that the mere existence of gluconeogenesis is not sufficient to stating that carbohydrates, exogenous carbohydrates, are not required for human consumption and human physiology, okay? It's the rate at which your body can create glucose through such a process. How efficient is it? And that's why I said it depends on what definition you're using of efficient, because a lot of people will isolate the gluconeogenic system and say it's inefficient because of how much substrate has to go into creating one glucose molecule. Well, that's great. You isolated that entire system from the rest of the system. You took a gear out of an entire system of gears. Okay, but let's add in another gear. Well, when is gluconeogenesis dependent on? During times of fatty acid oxidation? And how much ATP does one 16 carbon chain fatty acid, saturated fatty acid, create? 129. So in the grand scheme of things, is gluconeogenesis efficient? Yes. In isolation, you can make the argument, no, if we're using the definition that they often use. I'm using a different definition of efficient, which is the rate at which the body in a human genome, in the Homo sapiens sapien genome, can create glucose, which is extremely efficient, that of hypercarnivores. Hint, hint, because we are.
Body composition, and your metabolic and hormonal health.
Well, so metabolic health, and then you put a calorie meter on the screen. Last I checked, you cannot consume a calorie. You don't yield calories from your food. The only calories involved in metabolic pathways and metabolic processes are the ones that are not involved in those processes, but are released from as a byproduct, as an inefficiency product from exothermic biochemical reactions that occur in the body and have no effect on your weight because calories are units of heat energy and are effectively photons when made manifest in the real world and therefore have no mass because they cannot be brought to rest. The human body absorbs mass in the forms of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and alcohol, actually. Chemically interacts those substances under control of molecular oxygen. They react in such a way so as to alter the positioning of the chemical bonds. And since those reactions are exothermic, meaning they release heat, as opposed to endothermic, meaning they actually use heat to effectuate, they release heat in the form of calories, yes. 70% of which is actually released and forms and creates body heat, and 30% of which is actually encapsulated by the body in between ADP and PI to form ATP through either substrate level phosphorylation or oxidative phosphorylation. There's no calorie transport chain, there's an electron transport chain. Okay, our body doesn't use heat energy. It doesn't use energy even, really. If you think about it, it uses chemical potential energy when ATP is released to power chemical processes, but not heat energy. And so you're not consuming calories, by the way. No food has calories in it. The calorie number on food labels is how many calories would be yielded from that food if you rapidly combusted it in a bomb calorimeter, with the notion, the belief, stemming from the 1890s actually, that the body does that too because it's also a thermodynamic system, completely failing to understand that we're an open system, not a closed system, the latter of which a bomb calorimeter is. And therefore, you have to consider the law of conservation of mass into the equation, which also isn't a law, and then it's just, anyway.
Just reopened a limited number of new spots for my exclusive coaching program.
Okay, so, well, you want to talk about a coaching program, you should join the one that I'm affiliated with Carnivore Coach Peter, if you actually want to be internationally certified and accredited, which allows you to get insurance, for example, a lot easier, so that you can coach clients yourselves, because we need more coaches in the space that actually know what they're talking about. Links in the description for the website, and also the links to get a hold of Peter directly to sign up for the course. Go through Peter for that, because that's something that needs to be done, and he can negotiate a payment plan with you. These people are coaches. We need to saturate the space from the other end to balance things out.
Program, you'll be able to directly speak with me 7 days per week.
Well, who cares? Who would want that, Mike?
Get my personalized guidance to rebuild your health. So,
well, so you believe.
To mikefave.com.
No.
Spot before spots run out. Okay.
No.
There are 3 major factors to consider when we are going to be ranking these sugar sources. So,
well, again, bread and circuses, because the things that that you're stating need to be ranked do not need to be ranked, really, in terms of determining which sugar sources you should be consuming, because that's none of them, Mike. The only time that these 3 things should be considered, if these 3 things are even grounded in any level of rational intellect, is whenever you're trying to determine which is the least contraindicated. Buy now. Link in the description below for the 2nd edition. In all formats now. Ebook is out on many platforms, and another to come. So no, Mike, this is just, I mean, like I said in the very first minute of this video, we're done. We're also not. Let's just keep going. Let's just keep going.
Break into that first, and then we'll get directly into the ranking. So the first things first is the effect of the sugar source on your blood glucose level.
Which is highly variable depending on what you were consuming it with, what your activity level was that day, what your sleep level was that day, whether you're menstruating or not, if you are a female. Wow, okay, so are you going to start observing the glycemic index, which has more noise than there is signal in any clinical analysis? What scientific literature are you going to reference here? This goes back to what I always say. The broader, the better when it comes to inferences. A lot of people might be surprised to hear that observational studies are probably my favorite type of study when it comes to actually trying to analyze a signal or detect a signal in science, so long as you have a sufficient sample size, like a very large sample size. 10,000 is good. More is even better. Like a lot more is even better. Okay, it depends on the context, of course. And the reason for that is because it's a broad inference. The more deep you go, like, oh, the effect of the sugar source on your blood glucose, which is dependent on so many different so many different factors, the more noisy your signal is that you derive. The broader the inference, the better, because sure, there's plenty of confounders, but the deeper you go, the more you try and analyze, you introduce even more confounders and spurious variables. So believe it or not, I'm actually a fan of those. What I'm not a fan of is the way that people explain the conclusions of those, not understanding how to distinguish between causality and a mere association. This is why we just are more fundamental, we're more rudimentary. Okay, let's go back to the root here. What is the requirement for exogenous carbohydrates in the human diet? Is it 0? Yes. From every single inference we have, there are theories that we could have a requirement for 10 to 20, up to maximum 50, depending on your size, whatever. I've made that theory before. Rob Sy was sitting here saying that theory is fact. I already covered that. From every inference we have, it's 0. Suck it up, okay? It's 0. What is the best way to dysregulate your blood glucose level? Consuming sugar. That's the most conducive way of doing it. Spike, trough, sometimes a trough below baseline, postprandial hypoglycemia, reactive hypoglycemia. So the obvious solution here is to not consume the sugar. You're engaging in bread and circuses in order to justify people's addictions, including yourself, by the way, Mike, including your own, Mike.
How does your body process the sugar source? How fast does that sugar source actually hit the bloodstream?
Okay, well, it hits it extremely fast if you consume it in isolation because it enters the bloodstream through the duodenum almost instantaneously, effectively instantaneously, Mike, unless you're consuming it with fiber. Like I said, in isolation, that's the case. If you consume it with fiber, if you consume it with fat and protein, different story. Then it's even more variable. Depends on when you ate which thing first. I mean,
The second thing that we're going to look at is digestibility of the sugar source.
okay. Well, so all sugar sources, if they're simple carbohydrates, are very easily digestible. Just because you can digest something easily doesn't mean that you should be consuming it. You can digest cyanide easily. And just because something is digestible doesn't mean it's better than something that isn't digestible, by the way. I would rather consume fiber than cyanide, Mike. So again here, this is it's a waste of time, isn't it? Digestibility of the sugar source. No.
Going to be is does this sugar source have a high FODMAP content, which are essentially fermentable carbohydrates?
Yes, we understand. Yes. So there's things like soluble fiber that are fermented. So it would be high FODMAP if something has a lot of soluble fiber, like an apple. Fruit has a lot of soluble fiber. Or something that has resistant starch, like a sweet potato, which also depends on how you make it too. There's always going to be some resistant starch, but depending on how you make it, you can change the composition to make it higher in resistant starch, etc. But, well, so what? Depending on who you are, that could actually be worse. Look into Lee Copus, everyone. Someone that lost his colon from eating fiber.
We can't break down that the bacteria in our gut can, and also the glucose to fructose ratio. Because as I've talked about,
Well, first of all, let me just put it this way. If you can't digest something, you shouldn't be eating it. That applies to fiber. In the context of general dietary protocols that people embark upon and engage in, that's the most salient factor is fiber. So if it has fiber in it, that's a sign that you shouldn't be consuming it. There's no requirement for it. And the degree to which we encountered that throughout evolution was not to a degree that put enough, at least, of a pressure on our genes to genotypically evolve to have an indication for it in the diet. If there was, it was an extremely small amount, and you can get that from having some psyllium husk or something like that. It's probably not going to give you any problem, but we do know that there's no requirement for it. So what I'm saying is that it might be the case, it's probably the case by my estimation, that if you don't consume fiber, it may at the very least, or at the very most, be a 95% approximation to a species appropriate diet, if everything else is 100% consistent, as opposed to a 100% consistent indication level. Well, so what? 95%? there, I think that's pretty damn good. It's just my opinion, though. Do what you'd like.
Videos, if there's too much fructose in ratio to glucose in a sugar source,
Determined by what? You, Mike? So, in other words, your opinion?
actually lead to digestive issues because the fructose is not absorbed well. Now, the last piece is
Well, according to whom on the basis of what? I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong, but that's news to me. I mean, granted, I'll say this: if you are right, that's better than if it were extremely absorbable, because fructose is the most damaging carbohydrate that you can consume. It is the most glycating to tissues, 7 to 10 times more glycating than that of glucose, in vitro at least. It's not like all in vitro studies are useless. Most of them are. But if you're going to look at the reactivity of a molecule to another protein, well, I think that's pretty sufficient. But you know what? Take it with a grain of salt, in vitro. And also, it seems to drain the ATP concentrations, the purine pool in your hepatocytes, your liver cells, because of the way that it's metabolized, which is effectively the same as glycolysis, except that it's a fast acting step or pathway. It's faster acting, which means that ATP is actually converted into ADP, and then the ADP is converted into AMP. And you get a buildup of AMP, which disrupts your purine equilibrium, so to speak, the ATP equilibrium. And, well, that drains the ATP pool, at least in isolation. You can counteract that with other things, but do you want something that has that influence on your liver cells? I say in isolation, and therefore we can't make any causal inferences. However, something that reinforces the idea that taking that in isolation is still sufficient to saying fructose is contraindicated is the fact that lots of high fructose consumption is highly associated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Fatty liver, meaning the liver can't keep up with the inductions into it, fat, protein, and then fructose too, which can be transmuted directly into fat at the level of the liver itself. By the way, a bunch of AMP that gets broken down in order to try and hedge against that disruption in the equilibrium. It is broken down into uric acid, urate at physiological pH and according to its pK value, which is also highly associated with gout. Not to say that is necessarily the cause, but urate crystals are a common characteristic, if not the most common, of gout. It's not just from eating purines from meat. It's eating a bunch of fruit, fructose specifically, that's probably the culprit, considering that we've been eating meat for millions of years regularly, and fructose very, very transiently and in small amounts.
nutrient density. So we know the sugar sources are rich in sugar, but we also want micronutrients like vitamins and minerals present.
Right, but that is another enthymeme there that is based on a premise that you should be acquiring nutrition from plants, or that you require nutrition from plants, which you don't. You can find all of the minerals, vitamins, nutrients in general that you require in the exact amounts required for your physiology as a human being in the flesh and associated fat of large ruminant animals and nothing else. Evinced by the fact that, first of all, that's what from every single hard inference and even observational inferences that we have, what we were eating regularly for millions of years on a quotidian basis, but also that there is no science available to claim that a carnivore diet approach that attempts to best approximate our species appropriate, species specific diet is in any way deficient and causes deficiency diseases to arise. Now, to be logically consistent, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. However, what that does mean is that that's merely your speculation, and I think that speculation is silly because of what I just said in the beginning of this little tangent here.
Actually help improve the utilization of that sugar and also
Well,
adjust.
you don't need to utilize exogenous carbohydrates. You can utilize all the glucose that you need to utilize by creating it through gluconeogenesis, given our efficiency of it, that being that of hypercarnivores. From every inference we have, this is nonsense. Why do I don't even think you understand how glucose is actually required in the body. For any of you that are wondering, check out that video. I did a video on this. It's carb delusion exposed, because it is a delusion. Oh, glucose is your primary energy source. Well, first of all, what do you mean by energy source? Because you don't derive energy from substrates. You don't take energy from them. You don't convert them into energy. You use it to create energy. So the law of conservation of energy, yeah, no. But putting that aside, let's just accept that glucose is your primary energy source. That depends on what you're eating. It's your primary energy source, so your source of energy created by the mitochondria. If you're consuming carbohydrates primarily, yes, primary energy source. Mine? Whose? Mine? Because it's not mine. Because I consume fat and protein. Fat is my primary energy source. And ketone bodies produced through beta oxidation in the liver. I mean, so no. And then when people say, well, no, okay, it might not be your primary one, but it's your preferred fuel source. Okay, this word preference it needs to stop being used when it comes to the body because the body itself doesn't have a consciousness. And people might think, oh, well, that's captious, that's pedantic, Eddie. No, it isn't. What it means is that it doesn't matter whether your body prefers to use something. If the chemical pressures are that favor the use of some other substrate that is actually poisonous to the body, well, it's going to use it. That's how it works. It's not going to just shut it out and be like, no, 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 no. Okay. What they're really trying to say is it's the appropriate fuel source for human beings. Like that's what we're supposed to be using. Well, it doesn't seem like that either. And the reason for that is because first of all, from every inference we have, the amount of time that we are exposed to simple carbohydrates, and this goes for every animal, by the way, every single animal is extremely minimal. The only time that you're deriving them is from fruit during fruit season, so it was seasonal, and also fruit being fruit that wasn't hybridized to the degree that it is today and grafted to be larger, juicier, sweeter. I mean, even in the last 100 years, blueberries have become massive, apples, oranges have become massive, watermelons. I'll put a picture up on the screen of what fruit used to look like even 100 or 200 years ago and how it was depicted. Now imagine how it was thousands of years ago. Some fruit could still kill you, by the way, and so we probably avoided those, unless we really knew what the hell they were, okay? Because plants are toxic. That's another point to add. Every single plant is toxic to some degree. Now, by that logic alone, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be consuming plants. I understand that. By that logic alone, in isolation, because if that's the case, then there shouldn't be anything such as an herbivore. They should all be dying because all plants are toxic. Yeah, it depends on how much you've genotypically adapted to those plants. However, it's important to mention that herbivores have adapted to really about 2 or 3 plants, if that. If they eat any other plants, they'll die because plants, they haven't evolved for those. So anyway, yes, the amount of simple carbohydrates we were deriving from our food, very, very minimal, very transient, unless we came across a beehive or something. And then, yes, well, we sought carbohydrates out. There's a taste for them, obviously. Because if you're living in a time where you're always risking starvation, well, it's great to get fat, okay? And carbohydrates plus fat together, that's a great way of getting some fat on you. That distinction's important. You can cut all fat out and all protein out and you can get super skinny. That's veganism. Bunch of carbohydrates. It's all contextual, okay? Everything's a complex system, okay? So our genotypic, our genes have not evolved to withstand that stimulus. So that's one inference. The other inference is above a certain concentration that's most conducively achieved by consuming it, the carbohydrates are toxic and they cause lots of brain fog. Okay. At lower concentrations than what would have to be attained by other animals like hummingbirds to become immediately toxic, which is why hummingbirds can have postprandial glucose levels of 42 millimoles per liter, which is about 755 milligrams per deciliter, by the way. And yet they still have HbA1c values that are lower than that of non-diabetic humans. Well, because they've evolved for it. So there you go, all right? Which is also why their gluconeogenic efficiency is low. Well, that's crazy, isn't it? Okay, there's many, many inferences here, Mike. Stop pretending like there's any inferences. And I haven't even listed all of them, but I have to get going. I have to get going. It's just a myth. It's just an opinion.
That sugar is processed by the microbiomes. These also include plant compounds like polyphenol compounds such as flavonoids.
Right. You mean polyphenols, those being compounds that are produced by the plant to protect them from sunlight. So polyphenols are not anti-nutrients and they're not toxins based on that logic alone. But plants and animals have disparate operating systems, and therefore you better be real adapted to those plants in order to say with conviction that they're in any way helpful when it comes to polyphenols and all this other garbage. They're not required.
We want to make sure that we're having sources that are rich in these components.
No, you want to make sure that you're having sources of food that are actually congruous with what our genes evolved to withstand to a genotypic degree throughout our evolutionary history, from every hard inference and observational inference that we have.
The 3 major criteria that we're going to look at when we are ranking the sugar sources.
Right, a waste of time.
On a note here that there are other carb sources like starch sources, but this video is going to be specifically covering sugar sources.
Starches break down to glucose in your mouth. So sugar, salivary amylase, And before people sit here and go, you want to talk about evolution, Eddie, but then you sit there and pretend that salivary amylase in the mouth doesn't indicate that we should be consuming carbs. Yeah, because it doesn't necessarily at all. We actually selected for salivary amylase, or the genes that produce it, multiple times throughout history, okay? You need to understand positive and negative selection pressures, and you need to understand when traits are selected for and when traits are actually selected against. When do you actually lose traits? Because when you understand that, you'll understand why we still have salivary amylase from our ancestral past. There's no reason to get rid of it.
Be in alignment with this new trending diet that we're seeing, the sugar diet. All right, so we have a variety.
It's a fad. And you know what? It's honestly already died down, which I'm happy about that. So that's good.
Sugar sources that we're going to look at here, and we're going to rank them from S tier, which is super, to F tier, which is fail.
Based on an opinion, but you know what? Great marketing ploy there because everyone likes tier lists. So, okay, first thing on the list, molasses. Good. So I think we already covered everything about carbohydrates, but now what we're going to start covering is the way that it was actually processed. Pesticides, herbicides.
Source that we're going to look at here to start is going to be molasses. Now, molasses is a byproduct of the process of making cane sugar. I'm going to put this here in B tier.
Based on no fundamental logic. It's just arbitrary selection criteria, basically. I mean, that's what it is.
The reason I'm going to put this in B tier is because the molasses actually has quite a bit of micronutrients present. Now, it is a very...
So what? So what, Mike? So if I started to consume cyanide tomorrow, I'm not saying that sugar is exactly as harmful as cyanide. That would be silly and stupid, but that's not the point. If I started to consume cyanide tomorrow that isn't required and above a certain amount is toxic, and you sat there and said, well, there's certain cyanide sources that are better than others. One of them that's better actually has a bunch of vitamin C contained in it. Everyone would look at you like you're a moron because you shouldn't be consuming the cyanide. And yet here you are saying basically the same damn thing, but with a more innocuous compound. And you'll struggle to find a more objective figure in the space than me. Okay, I'm not going to pretend like they're in any way the same when it comes to the effects on the body. Okay, obviously not. Cyanide it forms suicide bonds, frankly, with a bunch of compounds, covalent bonds with enzymes, and ruins them. I mean, that's what it does. And it also interacts with your electron transport chain to cause a bunch of hypoxia, basically, irrespective of the oxygen concentration in your blood. Carbon monoxide will do the same thing. I mean, this is all the biochemistry and stuff like that. But either way, there's plenty of damage that glucose will do as well. It also covalently binds to proteins and deranges them and causes inflammation.
Digesting sugar. So it's going to be absorbed fast and it may rock somebody's blood sugar pretty quickly. But
So in what population, Mike? You're going to say, oh, well, it might do it pretty quickly. Yeah, well, okay, so it might not. So that might and may are really great words because it leaves may and might not completely on the table. Replace may and might whenever you see any headline with might not. I'm not kidding. It'll really just put things into perspective for you. It really will. Gosh. I mean, what population did you study? And if you didn't study it, you probably didn't. Fine, whatever. What paper did you cite? Or did you base this off of? What researchers from the paper that you're basing this off of, if you're even basing this off of a paper, what population did they study? What was the sample size? Was there statistical power that was yielded or achieved, rather? What was the signal to noise ratio? Was it reported with a standard error or a standard deviation? Better be a standard deviation if it was one sample. You don't report a standard error in a sample. Well, unless you're the authors that Dr. James DiNicolantonio likes to cite, because I had to cover that a while back. Check that video out if you'd like. Had to respond to pharmacy doctor James DiNicolantonio, who wanted to cast aspersions at me and throw a bunch of epithets. Anyway.
Content, as we're going to see here, and Chronometer actually brings...
Chronometer. Fantastic. Okay, so if we didn't know, if we were still uncertain about Mike's credibility here, Chronometer. Whatever.
The B tier, which is going to separate it from some of the other refined sugar sources that we've seen.
So, sugar is sugar is sugar, Mike.
Molasses, 1 tablespoon, about 13 grams of sugar. And
Yep, so 13 more than you actually require. Good.
Here we see that its glucose to fructose ratio is 1.7 grams to 1.6 grams. So pretty much 1-to-1, which is going to be important for that absorption.
Yeah, so it's also 50%, 50% when it comes to sucrose as well. Sucrose is table sugar, by the way. So you're basically telling people that table sugar is completely fine to consume. Do you realize what you're saying right now? In fact, there's more fructose. According to this thing, there's actually still 0.1 grams more fructose than glucose. So it's actually, if you want to be extremely pedantic, you can say, oh, it's actually technically worse than sucrose because there's more fructose in it. Pure glucose is better than pure fructose.
Also the rest of that sucrose, which is again 1-to-1 glucose to fructose. When we look at the micronutrients in molasses, it's quite rich, at least comparatively to honey and cane sugar.
Right, now compare that to red meat. This is a waste of time. Are you desperate for content, Mike?
Up in some of the B vitamins like vitamin B6, so 15% of the DRI. And the where it really shines here is going to be in the mineral content, where it's quite rich in calcium, copper, magnesium.
Right, and it's important to note that all of the percentages here are in reference to a normative sort of threshold baseline recommended range for these nutrients. According to whom, on the basis of what? What population? Are you going to sit here and genuinely say and or imply, so imply or explicitly state, that all nutritional requirements or these nutritional thresholds, these daily values, are applicable to every single person, irrespective of activity level, genotype, and phenotype? Because if you are going to say that, people shouldn't be listening to you. You need to go back and reflect a little bit, because this is an entire infameme right here. I know that you're probably going to be saying, Eddie, you probably just learned that word. Yeah, I did. I did learn the word. It's something, but it's one of those things where it's something that I would have been saying for years now, but I've used other words and longer sentences to explain it. But now there's one word that just is really compact. Great. It's based on premises that are premises rather, that are just completely myopic, reductionist. I mean, the D, what are they called? The RDAs and the RDIs. The RDAs and the RDIs, they're based on select small populations. And oftentimes, not only are they based on those populations, the people that set these values will usually double them just in case, because they know that not everyone requires the same amount. Sometimes they require more, but also sometimes they require less. So why didn't they just divide it by 2 instead of doubling it, multiplying it by 2? I mean, seriously. I mean, who's to say that, look, 7% of selenium, 7% of selenium needs. Who's to say that the absolute level of selenium that this represents, 3.7 micrograms, who's to say that that's not sufficient for someone? And this is why we get broader with our inferences. Zoom out here. What's a rule to follow? Okay, here's a fundamental rule. If someone is not presenting with a deficiency disease, if someone does not present with symptoms, they're fine. You are obligated to not intervene. I'm not the one that's coining this. That was Hippocrates when he said, do no harm. That's what he meant. It's the Hippocratic oath, do no harm, which nobody follows nowadays. Oh, let's just look at numbers, and then even if you're not presenting with symptoms, well, you're still out of range, and therefore we need to intervene. Dangerous, extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous, by the way. That is misanthropic, it's anti-human, and it needs to stop.
And then also potassium and manganese. So it's a pretty good source of certain minerals. I wouldn't make it the major source of carbohydrates.
That's your opinion. And this is also your opinion that you're about to say that I cut you off on. I wouldn't make this a major source of carbohydrates. You shouldn't make anything a major source of exogenous carbohydrates at all. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like you should never, ever, ever eat them or else you're a bad human or something like that. Okay, obviously people once in a while, they'll have 20 grams, they'll have a bite of something, they'll have a few bites of something, like whatever. The problem is saying that that's okay and appropriate. Because then when you do that, you shift the goalpost, you move the line in the sand even further. Okay, if you're going to sit here and say 20 grams, oh, that's not that bad, but you shouldn't be having 20 grams. You should be having 0. That's good. That's a good foundation. Okay, because then people are going to be, the noise around that, the amount that people are going to deviate is going to be around maybe 20, maybe 50 grams in either direction. If you sit here and say that you should be having 50 though, then it's going to be, oh, people are going to be deviating around 100 grams. They're going to think 100 grams is okay. And then, I mean, it's just moving the goalpost further and further till you got a problem on your hands. So no, the baseline is 0. The indication level is 0. That's where the line is drawn. Okay.
in the diet, but it is a good addition also to supplement some of these vital minerals in the diet. And this is
supplement, there's no requirement for supplementation on a carnivorous diet. And by the way, even if there were, that's not an indication that it's not the best approximation to a species-appropriate, species-specific diet, because we live in a modern world. However, the irony is that even in a modern world, you still don't require supplementation on a carnivorous diet. Okay? Given the fact that we live in a modern world, you may want to take a nutraceutical or something that can hedge against, damage that you incur from even just breathing the air, right? And that's why I'm an affiliate with Cerule, and I'm particularly fond of their Stem Enhance Ultra flagship product, which causes the release of your own adult stem cells from your bone marrow that can differentiate into any damaged cell and make it completely new with full-length telomeres. So they actually have it's a new cell with a full lifespan. And by the way, you don't run out of those stem cells. You die with the same amount of adult stem cells in your bone marrow that you were born with, precisely because they are an immortal cell line. You should check that out. Links in the description below for information on those products and how to go about buying them.
actually using clients who have a difficult time tolerating calcium supplements.
Well, once again, why are you supplementing with calcium? Is it perhaps because your diet is deficient? Again, I just said that even if it is deficient in modern day terms, it doesn't necessarily, by that logic alone, mean that it's not appropriate. I understand. And also, considering the fact that some people are just metabolically unhealthy, so to speak, some people need a supplement initially before, we all understand this. It's a transition process, all that stuff. We get that. But wouldn't it be great if you could get to a diet that requires the least amount of supplementation possible as a function of it approximating a species appropriate diet as much as possible, as best as possible? I mean, yes.
Now, the next source that we have here is maple.
Yes, maple syrup. Okay, so maple syrup, I mean, we encountered that even less frequently than honey because you actually have to go through a process of making that, and the amount that you make, it was so counterproductive to actually go about doing this. This is a new modern invention.
Syrup. And maple syrup, I'm going to have to put that in D tier. Now, the reason that I'm putting the maple syrup in D tier.
Well, the reason is because of arbitrary selection criteria. We already covered that. It's arbitrary.
Because it is not very nutrient dense. It's not as nutrient dense as.
So what? Who cares? Because even if it were, you still shouldn't be consuming it, Mike.
This is, and it's very rapidly digesting. It hits the system pretty fast. Which.
So what, Mike? All sugar does in consumed in isolation. You're sitting here saying, oh, it enters the system really fast. Well, are you saying that there's a possibility in certain people that it doesn't? So basically what you're saying is you're making a generalization to the entire population based on a sample that you're not referencing, by the way, either. You're just spewing garbage out your mouth hole, your face, Mike.
This does as well. The nice thing, though, is that the maple syrup is digested pretty well by many people because it has almost all sucrose, which is 1-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio.
So table sugar, right. So the white sugar that you see in those shakers. Yeah. So that's what it is. Well, thanks for telling us, Mike.
So people will digest it well. And it does have a bit of micronutrient. It has a little bit of
So what? I have a feeling that we're going to be repeating ourselves a lot during this video.
Flavin and a little bit of manganese, but not really much to write home about here. So it's going to go in D tier, something that you can use to sweeten things up, but probably not going to be an ideal primary carbohydrate source. The next one that we're going to...
There is no such thing as an ideal carbohydrate source if by ideal you mean in any way indicated whatsoever. In 99% of circumstances, general circumstances that human beings find themselves in, Mike. And I give that caveat because sugar is a drug. Check out a video I did on this, by the way. It is a drug. Whether I like it or not, whether you like it or not, it is. And therefore, drugs have certain indications. Anesthesia is a drug. So in 99% of circumstances, so in other words, in general circumstances, I should not have anesthesia administered into my body. But there are certain circumstances where I should, such as undergoing a surgery. Well, there you go. So sugar has certain ones as well, particularly if you are going to undergo extremely intense, so high intensity interval training, and you're at the very, very last bit of the set, and you're about to undergo failure. 5 grams of carbohydrates exogenously introduced can actually cause you to get more reps in almost instantly because of how quickly it's absorbed. It's interesting. I did a video on this, but it's only available in our carnivore coaching program, as I alluded to in the beginning, linked in the description below. I've done multiple modules for that program, multiple modules. So it's good.
About here is honey. Now, everybody loves to talk about the benefits of honey.
The purported benefits, because benefits is a cause and effect statement in the majority of circumstances in which the word is used, Mike. And there are no studies that can inform upon the benefits, the risk, whatever it may be, of any food as that relates to any hard health outcomes in human beings over any given period of time throughout the entire time human nutrition science has existed. There never has been, and there never will be, because you cannot control for human beings. And last I checked, science requires control, because if it doesn't have control, then it is by definition theology.
Actually look at honey on paper, it's basically just sugar. So it has some polyphenol compounds.
Yeah, so everything that you've just said is just sugar. Mike, oh my God. It has some polyphenolic compounds. Here's another thing, by the way. He hasn't even said this. Let's see if I can predict what he says next. A lot of people will say, well, there's enzymes. There's digestive enzymes in honey, though. They can help with digestion. If you look at every single digestive enzyme in honey, they're all enzymes that break down the sugar in the honey. That's it. Oh, it's antimicrobial. First of all, that doesn't mean you should be consuming it, okay? There's plenty of synthetic compounds under my kitchen sink that are antimicrobial, okay? I'm not going to eat those. But interestingly enough, what they mean by antimicrobial is that a byproduct, I believe, I'll have to look into this again. This was months ago. I believe that there is an enzyme in honey that, as a consequence of breaking down the sugar, produces H2O2, so hydrogen peroxide. That's what it does, which, by the way, is not, it's antimicrobial because it targets bacteria. It targets all bacteria, by the way, so including your gut bacteria, just so you know that. The good ones and the bad ones, okay? Great, if you have any bad ones. And who's to say which ones are bad or good? Anyway, whatever. But also, H2O2 is harmful to every tissue of your body above a certain concentration. It's a reactive oxygen species. So, wow, that's awesome. That's great, isn't it? People are sitting here saying, well, it has antimicrobial properties and it has digestive enzymes in it, not understanding what they actually mean when they say that. Because then you look into it and you go, well, okay, so it shouldn't be consumed then, because why would I be consuming hydrogen peroxide and also digestive enzymes that don't do anything for my digestion except help break down the sugar that is in the honey, which my body would have done anyway, irrespective of whether or not the digestive enzymes were in the honey.
And then different honey varieties can actually have a different breakdown of micronutrients, but honey overall is a very refined.
So basically what you're saying is that Chronometer is a bunch of It's full of a bunch of because every single different form of the food has different nutritional makeups and compositions. The noise around the signals here are immense.
Source, we have about 1 tablespoon is going to be about 17 grams of sugar here. And when we look at it, it has...
Yeah, so a tablespoon has 17 grams of sugar. Are you hearing this? You know how, do you realize how little of an amount a tablespoon is?
Almost a balanced glucose to fructose ratio, 8.7 grams of fructose and 7.6 grams of glucose.
Yeah, so almost, so it's still worse than table sugar. I mean, what is that ratio? What is that ratio? 8.7 plus 7.6, 16.3. So 8.7 divided by 16.3. Right, so it's 53% fructose, a little more than 53%, 53.37% fructose. Good, great. When sucrose is, well, about 3.7% less than that or something, or 3.4%. in this specific honey studied, by the way, or these honeys studied, these are all averages.
This is going to be important for absorption. We want that 1-to-1 to optimize the absorption of the carbohydrate in the intestine. And
so this is just a bunch of theology being thrown out and spit at the screen by Mike Fave.
different honeys can have different ratios, and some of them can skew a little bit more towards fructose.
Yeah, which makes it even worse.
And it has very minimal glucose. So you have a lot of free sugars here. When we look at the micronutrients, not really that many micronutrients present. And so given that it is free sugars.
You hear that, Paul Saladino? You hear that?
Relatively decent ratio and mineral and micronutrients. It's digested well, but it can hit the blood sugar pretty heavily and pretty rapidly.
Yeah, because it's sugar, Mike. Great, good. So you could just cut the fucking shit out.
That's why we're going to put honey here in the E tier, which is below maple syrup and below
poor Paul.
molasses. Now, going along with honey, we have sugar. I would put granulated sugar and honey together in that E tier.
Because they're the same, effectively.
The reason why I would do that again is the granulated sugar is basically pure sucrose. So,
well, no, Mike, Paul Saladino said that the sugar in honey is completely different than the sugar in table sugar, in sucrose.
Sucrose is 1-to-1 glucose to fructose, so it's going to be well absorbed, not going to cause as much digestive issues. Now, high amount.
Well, who's to say that, Mike? You know how every single person is going to react to sugar? What if someone never consumes sugar ever? They've never done so in their entire life. That's rare. I envy that person. And then they consume sugar. So it's not going to cause them any digestive upset. You know that for a fact? You could be right. You could also be wrong. That was really convicting.
This could drive dysbiosis in the intestine because it doesn't have any of the polyphenols that we see with honey.
But because it doesn't have any polyphenols, so what's the mechanism behind polyphenols preventing dysbiosis in the gut? What science are you going to provide to support that claim? Because you want to talk about someone that contends with the science. When I see a paper, I read it. It's me. You provide a study, we'll analyze the thing. Watch my channel, Mike. I've done it on multiple occasions.
Also doesn't have very much micronutrients. So I wouldn't make
very many
major sources of carbohydrate in a diet. Pure table sugar or cane sugar, because we're going to miss quite a bit of micronutrients and it's going to hit the system pretty rapidly.
Right. So that's why I get my micronutrients not from sugar. I get it from actual indicated food.
Next sugar source we have here is dextrose.
Right. So what the hell are we doing? What is he doing? Are you seeing this? Are you not thinking the same thing I'm thinking? What is the point of this?
And dextrose is going to fall along the same lines as honey and sugar.
Yup. You know, while you're at it, you could put maple syrup in the E category and the molasses in the E category, then remove all of the other categories, label E as no category whatsoever, and then there you go. Just call it sugar. There you go. Great.
Glucose, there's no fructose. So I'm going to put this specifically in E tier. And the dextrose, because it doesn't have fructose, is likely to rock the blood sugar pretty heavily because it's all glucose. It's going to hit.
Right, but hold on a minute. So this whole time you've been sitting here pretending that if it doesn't rock your blood sugar, spike it, that therefore you're not succumbing to a bunch of glycation damage? That's not the case. Fructose doesn't raise your blood glucose level, and yet it glycates your tissues more than glucose does. It also doesn't directly impact the HbA1c value because it's not detected by an HbA1c test because it's not glucose. What does that mean? What does all those, technobabble words mean? What does that mean? It means that whenever you consume fructose with glucose, your blood glucose will rise, which indicates glycation happening actively, okay? But not to the degree that it is actually occurring. It's occurring even more, even higher than that. Your blood glucose level is not congruous with a theoretical glycation level. The blood glucose level will be lower than your glycation level. The glycation level will be higher because fructose doesn't impact blood glucose because it's not glucose. That would be blood fructose. That also means that if you're consuming only fructose and you're going to use your HbA1c value to determine to use as a proxy for how much glycation you're succumbing to on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, it's going to be artificially low, so to speak. You could think of it as, because you're actually succumbing to a lot more glycation. It's fructation, you could think of it as. And the reason for that is because the HbA1c value it measures glycated hemoglobin through glucose-mediated mechanisms, not fructose-mediated. So you're sitting here saying, well, dextrose is going to be really bad. It's worse because it doesn't have fructose in it, and therefore it'll spike your blood glucose more. Because instead of it being 50-50 glucose and fructose, it's 100% glucose. But that begs an entire question. The premise itself needs to be questioned, which is, well, does that mean that does blood glucose necessarily indicate total glycation rate? Well, I just covered that. No, it doesn't. So what? I would say, Mike, that if it's pure glucose, it's actually more innocuous than sucrose because I understand chemistry. At least the elements of chemistry that are relevant to diet.
Some pretty rapidly and spike that blood sugar pretty fast.
And lifestyle. So spike it really fast. Yeah, okay, great. So stop consuming sugar. There you go, done.
Is some people who have issues with fructose metabolism, they may tolerate dextrose better. So there's some
So what, Mike? You know, in those people, sugar isn't required either.
There's some cons with the dextrose, but I would still put it in the E tier because, again, when we look at dextrose, it's all glucose and there's not really much micronutrients to write home about. There's basically zero. So we're not going to get the vitamins and minerals we need, and there's no
no, that's not true. Because what if you're consuming meat, Mike? Then you will.
Compounds from the plants that we're looking for to help shift the microbiome. Next, we have the infamous high fructose corn syrup.
Right. So glyphosate laden. A lot of people believe that high fructose corn syrup is way worse than sucrose. It may very well be, but they think so for the wrong reasons. They think so because, well, it's higher in fructose. Let's put it this way. Cane sugar, coconut sugar, whatever meretricious dressed up form of sugar that marketers want to pretend isn't sugar, it's better. Oh, it's coconut sugar, actually. It's totally not white sugar. Yes, it is. Cane sugar, coconut sugar. It's all 50% glucose, 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup, commercial high fructose corn syrup, is 54% fructose and 46% glucose. Wow. However, here's a caveat that you might not know. In restaurants, high fructose corn syrup is oftentimes up to 65% fructose. If you want to know why whenever you get a Sprite at McDonald's or other fast food chains, it tastes so much better than a canned Sprite or any soda, whatever it may be, there it is, because fructose is far sweeter than glucose. Far sweeter. There you go. Someone actually sent that to me a long time ago. They sent me a picture that they took in the back rooms. I'll put it on the screen.
Now, high fructose corn syrup is made by basically fermenting corn so that you have a pure glucose syrup and you get fructose present with it. And the ratio of glucose to fructose is shifted higher towards fructose. So we're going to have a little
by 4% commercially in commercial grade products.
More fructose than we do glucose. This actually creates a problem depending on the percentage, because if you have a high
depending on the percentage
of fructose without the glucose present, that can lead to issues with absorption. The next thing is because it is like an industrial made compound to some extent, and it could be
to a large extent
GMO corn, and then it's made by this fermentation process. There is some concern potentially.
So hold on a minute. GMO corn, or do you mean herbicides and pesticides? Because that's the major problem, frankly. Because everyone wants to pretend like, oh, well, you don't want GMOs, genetically modified organisms, except that's literally all of what plants are today. We genetically modified them throughout history. So it's nothing really that new. The only time that it's really bad is if they're trying to like introduce the V word or something into plants or something like that, which I think I saw something like that. I don't even know how that makes any sense. I know that I'll perhaps get some pushback from you, my dear viewer, but sometimes Newton's third law kicks into place. And if one side of the aisle, I'm going to keep it vague, gets really extreme, it would be foolish to believe that the other side wouldn't do the exact same thing. And sometimes what that means is that you become jaded to everything and you believe that every single thing is a conspiracy. theory or something, a conspiracy. And I think that sometimes, especially during 2020, that started happening. I'm not pretending like most things that we know today aren't based on lies, because most of them are, which makes it far more probable for people to buy into those conspiracy theories. But the one that I just referenced, I think, may have trended a little towards the unfounded realm. I could be wrong. I find purveying truth extremely fascinating and interesting, so I'd be the last person to just reject it outright because it sounds silly. I'm also a carnivore, so that should be enough of a reinforcement of that claim. But anyway, let's just. Oh, we're starting off great today. Inflammatory.
Contamination with it. And on top of that, it has very little micronutrients. It has basically zero micronutrients.
So what?
Has no polyphenolic compounds, and it's
So what? That, if anything, is probably a good thing.
typically combined in some of the worst foods that you could eat as far as the processed packaged foods go. So I would put high fruit
Yeah, but that doesn't have any implication about corn syrup specifically.
corn syrup in the F tier here as one of the worst possible options to incorporate in the diet because it digestibility, speed at which it's going to hit the system, lack of micronutrients, lack of polyphenolic compounds, and the processing that goes involved in creating it. Now, the next source that we have here is agave syrup. People are going to be pretty surprised to find.
Wow. People are going to be pretty surprised to find what?
I'm going to put agave syrup in the F tier. Now, why am I going to put agave syrup in the F tier? Because almost all fructose. So when we look at agave syrup,
Yep. Okay. So that's definitely not great at all. That would make it one of the worst sources of sugar. Great. You shouldn't be consuming any of these. Let's just make it really simple. You should tally up how many times I have said this throughout this whole video, and you should continue doing so for the rest of the video. That'll be a fun game.
1 tablespoon is going to give us 15.9 grams of carbs. And then when we look at the breakdown, we're going to see 11.7 grams of fructose. Now, this is a problem because many people.
This is a problem, Mike, because fructose is not required and above a certain concentration is harmful to the body. To be even more specific as to why it's a problem, it is a problem because our genes have not evolved to withstand that much fructose in one bolus throughout our evolutionary history from every inference we have, Mike. Biochemical inferences, biochemical assays, observational paleoanthropology. I mean, it's that simple, Mike. I wish it weren't the case, okay? Fructose is yummy, Mike. I've said on this channel that I'm the desserts guy, man. It's true. Apple pie, favorite dessert of all time, hands down. You know the last time I've had apple pie? Probably 4 years ago, Mike. You know how many times I've wanted it? Quite a few times, even as a carnivore. It's that addict brain still there. Okay? You know what I eat instead? Eggs, pasture raised. And before people say, well, that's not evolutionarily consistent, is it, Eddie? Good point. The reason that I consume them is because, in terms of the makeup of the food, it is still a very great approximation to what we evolved consuming in terms of the fatty acid profile, the amino acid profile, the mineral and vitamin profile. They also have no anti-nutrients whatsoever, no plant toxins, and they have no carbohydrates, which is also a better approximation. Again, it's about the approximation and trying to get to the best approximation or the approximation that you're most comfortable with. Okay, so once in a while I have eggs. I have steaks, not grass-fed as of yet. Money is an issue. And salt, pastured grass-fed butter. And that's it, Mike. Once in a while I'll have some cheese, and it's not that much. So there you go. That's how I avoid the problem.
Not absorb fructose well without the presence of glucose. The intestine requires.
So what is the mechanism there, Mike? What is the mechanism there? How does that make any sense?
Both glucose and fructose be present to absorb that fructose. So if you just have.
How? Before the monosaccharides are absorbed into the body, they're broken down into monosaccharides from disaccharides if you consume them as such. And then the glucose will funnel through to the bloodstream, irrespective of fructose concentration. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? The only thing that he could be right about is that the only way that he could be possibly be correct about this is because of the monosaccharides differences in terms of their effects on the pancreas in secreting insulin. Glucose is insulinogenic, fructose isn't. So if you consume only fructose, maybe the absorption rate is lower because you don't have as much insulin to get it into the bloodstream. However, that on the surface, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because fructose itself, in terms of how it's utilized, is insulin independent. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Either way, you shouldn't be consuming any of them in the first place.
Fructose, it stays in the intestine, and the bacteria are able to get a hold of it and ferment it. So I think, and I've seen this with quite a few clients, when people eat large amounts of agave syrup, they tend to get digestive issues. So I think this is probably one of the worst sources to incorporate in the diet, because if you have bacteria ferment.
And who's to say that those digestive issues were a result necessarily of the fructose amounts? That is your opinion. You may or may not be correct.
Fructose, that can lead to a variety of metabolic concerns.
That may lead, because it also depends on how much you consume it.
Not use agave syrup. I would put that in the F tier with the high fructose corn syrup. For the next source here, we have 100% fruit jam.
Of course, he's going to rank this towards the top because all those plant nutrients, though, bro.
So for 100% fruit jam, the one that I specifically like to use personally, I'm not affiliated with them, is this St. Dalfor's jam. And I do like the strawberry one. And when you look at the ingredients, it's strawberries and it's sweetened only with fruit juice concentrate, fruit pectin, and lemon juice. So it's basically entirely fruit, and it's a very concentrated source of fruit because you get quite a bit of carbohydrate for a very small amount. So 1 tablespoon is going to give you 12 grams of carbohydrate, but it's coming entire, and this is all sugars, and it's coming entirely from fruits. So this is a good source to incorporate in the diet to help get some extra carbohydrate.
Which has no indication in the human diet. Mike, I know lots about carbohydrates. I know a lot about how they're utilized in human physiology. Carbohydrates are required for life. By the very manner of me sitting upright in this chair and lambasting you in front of this camera, with my lips moving and my tongue moving, there are multiple muscle fibers that are twitching to keep me upright. They are twitching using glycogen, which are glucose polymers. My red blood cells, my erythrocytes, as we speak, are using glycolysis because of the absence of mitochondria to produce the amounts of ATP they require. As a result of that, they are producing lactate as a byproduct. Lactate is then exported from the cell in order to preserve the pH balance of the cell, as well as to prevent allosteric inhibition of the glycolytic pathway in the first place to keep the glycolysis pathway running, and is then transported to the liver, or it's transported to another cell in need of oxidative substrate. Sure, fine. But it is, for the sake of the argument, transported to the liver to maintain pH balance of the blood and is used to create glucose. You need 2 lactate molecules to produce glucose, 1 molecule of glucose, but doesn't matter. Then that glucose goes back into the bloodstream and is picked up by another adjacent cell that is in need of, well, in my case, since I don't oxidize pyruvate, so you could say oxidized glucose, I'm oxidizing fat and ketones, it will use it for glycogen resynthesis for the next muscle twitch. Yes, glycogen is required for all muscle contractions of all intensities. Fact. Shulman and Rothman proved this first in a rattlesnake's rattle, and then later on it was observed in human beings as well. So before anyone says, no, glycogen is only required for high intensity training, false. Absolutely false. Not true. Anyway, let's continue.
I'm going to have to put the fruit jam in D tier. And the reason why I'm putting the fruit jam,
that's surprising,
D tier is because the fruit jam is very rapidly digested. And so it can spike the blood sugar pretty significantly for some people, especially if they're not used to carbohydrate.
So a spike in glucose is bad. It's contraindicated. Again, I emphasize, if you want to learn a big chunk of what I know, I mean, in a way, it only scratches the surface, but the foundations of my way of thinking, purchase this book today in any format you'd like. Self-narrated audiobook. I'm all about authenticity. paperback, hardcover, and ebook. Reflowable. Anyway.
And it's not very micronutrient dense. Next up, we have low FODMAP organic 100% fruit juice.
Oh boy, I can hear Paul from a mile away screaming, yes! Yes! Yes!
These are going to be things like orange juice, grapefruit juice, pineapple juice, grape juice.
Let's enunciate that G a little more next time.
Pomegranate juice, coconut water, blueberry juice, cranberry juice, lemon juice.
Blueberry juice. Great. I'm interested to know how that tastes.
And lime juice. These I'm going to put in A tier.
So lime juice, I mean, is anyone really drinking those? Lemon juice? Or are you just putting that down because it's technically still a fruit juice, so you just want to... A tier. Are you seeing this?
Why am I putting them in A tier? While they do have vitamins, they have minerals, they're very easily digested. They have 1-to-1 glucose to fructose ratio. They do not have...
Sorry, what did you just say? No. It is not a 1-to-1 fructose to glucose ratio, Mike. Have you lost your mind? Fruit is primarily fructose. You're also not mentioning sorbitol. And you know what? You want to get into quantum biology. You're not mentioning the deuterium concentrations either in these foods, which are most highly abundant in starches and anything with sugar, because sugar in plants, it's made with deuterium hydrogen bonds. Okay? You should look into how that affects your redox potential because of the proton pumping through ATP synthase. Its effects on ATP synthase. And by the way, proton pumping I should put in quotes because that's not exactly what's going on. Anyone who talks about that is demonstrating a complete destitution of knowledge regarding pH balance.
FODMAP content. These juice sources can hit the blood sugar pretty rapidly, especially if you have higher quantities of them. And for some people, that may give them a blood glucose spike depending on their state. And so I put them in A tier because you're going to want to be careful if you are metabolically impaired, having some of these very rapidly digesting juice sources. And you're going to want to incorporate whole fruit.
You are going to want to be careful if you're anybody, especially metabolically sick, though. Sure, fine. Metabolically deranged, however you want to put it. Consuming any sugar of any kind. Mike, I'm about to stop the video. I've covered everything.
With these as well to help adjust that blood glucose rise and help keep the blood sugar a little.
You can also adjust it by not having it happen in the first place, Mike.
More stable overall. So that's why they fall in A tier and not S tier. Okay, so next up we have the high FODMAP organic 100% fruit juice.
Okay, I'm done. Seriously, this is a waste of time. This is a complete and utter waste of time. I thought that Mike would bring more to the table here. Perhaps it was wrong of me to hold those high of expectations, or that high of expectations. Perhaps it was. Because I really, really cannot stand this idea. I mean, you've got Glucose Goddess saying the same thing. Oh, well, glucose, it glycates tissues. It's really bad. It's really bad for you. But it's also your preferred energy source. And therefore, you should continue consuming it. You should just consume it with a lot of fiber. Fiber. Are you out of your mind? Anyway, I'm done with this. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And also, once again, buy my book, Contrainidicated, a closer look and revision of mainstream health axioms that have perpetuated illness, disorder, and disease for over a century, if you've not bought that book already. And also, sign up to be a member of the Carnivore Certification Program, of course, as I alluded to in the beginning, and think about these products as well, these Cerule products. Because, just to hype you up a little more, if you email me behind the scenes at edgoki@pm.me, you can learn how to earn those products for free as well. Because who in their right mind wouldn't want that? And finally, something I haven't mentioned, subscribe to the Patreon as well if you're interested in seeing my videos 1 week early, ad-free, uncensored, and if you're interested in joining an exclusive Discord server for viewers such as yourself. So, with that being said, join me next time when we are reacting to more inane sugar diet nonsense. It's pretty much died down. I don't really care about it anymore. I don't think anyone really does. But join me next time when we see some coaches with arrogant ignorance beyond repair, really. So, till then.